Quiero que hablamos hoy sobre la reflexión y Coil actividades. Yo sé un poco español y creo que mi español es peor y limitado. So mostly I will be speaking in English, pero yo trato cuando puedo, and I will have some Spanish in the slides. Si tienes preguntas, dígame cuando tienes. I would like to have this more be a conversation. I don't like lecturing myself. But I want to talk a little bit today about reflective learning and some about, well, the what, the why, and the how, and how that reflects, how that relates to the kinds of experiences that you're going to be designing for your students. I will I'm recording what we're covering, so don't feel like you have to take a lot of notes. I will export this to my YouTube channel, and I will share the link, and we'll have the slides available as well. What I want to do is present a little bit of a framework around reflective learning. I'm no expert on reflective learning myself, but I have pulled out some specific models that I have shared with faculty to help them think about reflective learning. And we'll talk about some of those frameworks, and we'll talk about some of the ways you can use reflection prompts to help structure the way that your students reflect about their experiences. So, thoughts about reflective learning go back more than a century, back to Dewey. And he's often quoted as saying, we do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. It's not clear that he actually ever wrote those words, but those words clearly reflect the sentiment of much of his writing. I mean, the idea here is that we can all have experiences, but if we do not think about them, then we are not going to learn very much from them. So I like talking about this specifically in relationship to the Coil activities, the Coil courses that you're going to be developing, because this is experiential learning at a very high scale. Right? You are not forming partnerships so that Linda can lecture to Cesar's students and that Cesar can lecture to Linda's students. You're developing these partnerships so that your students can be involved in different collaborations, communicating with each other about the topics, and having that very applied kind of learning experience. So getting our students to be reflective about what they're doing will be important for them to get the most out of these activities that you're designing for them. Just a quick blurb for those of you in the room that are from SUNY campuses. We have, at a system level, a very highly promoted initiative for applied learning. All of the SUNY campuses, and I'm sure common at many other campuses as well, have a new mission to make sure that our students have applied learning experiences. And those experiences, in the case of the SUNY applied learning, require this ability to have structured reflection about the experience on the part of the students and a way for the faculty mentors to provide feedback. So those of you who are at SUNY campuses, your participation in these Coil courses can be a component of how your campus relates to this applied learning initiative. Okay, so what I want to do is, hopefully briefly, I am a lecturer after all, so I might ramble on. Cut me off if I go too long. But I want to talk a little bit, I want us to think a little bit about what reflection is, and then I want to cover just 2 or 3 of the main models of reflective learning, and then we'll talk about how it maps onto Coil activities. So this is just one definition of what reflection is. And I won't read through the definition, but what is important is that there is a relationship between what is going on externally and what is happening internally on the part of our students and us as faculty, frankly. Okay? So there is some external activity, some external experience, and that triggers some internal thought process that is the reflection. And reflective learning is all about how those reflections that are driven by the experiences we have can feed into our students' learning about the material. Okay, so here's where we start talking about some of the frameworks. And I want to get through this a little bit quickly, but I think I want to present works from 4 different people. First is this work on reflective learning by Schoen. And he has a lot of material on different ways of thinking about reflective learning. But I think what I want to highlight from his work is this distinction between reflection in action versus reflection on action. And that might seem like splitting hairs, but it's basically reflection in action is how can we make students be thoughtful about what they are doing in your learning activities while they are doing it. Okay. It's very easy, I teach a geology lab. It would be very easy for me to give students a checklist of, do this, do this, do this, do this, and they would be able to go through and check, yeah, I did that, I did that, I did that, without ever thinking while they were doing it, well, why am I doing this? Okay. So the reflection in action is, how can we get students to be thoughtful about what they are doing while they are doing it? The reflection on action is probably a little bit more important for our Coil interactions. This is, okay, we did this activity in class last week. I've had some time to think about it. I've had some time to step back from that activity. What new meaning can I generate by thinking back on what we did in the past? And that is basically what we're talking about in this reflection on action. So as you are working together tomorrow to design your learning activities that will allow the students to meet the learning outcomes that we've been talking about, you'll want to think about how can I make sure that students are being thoughtful when they are collaborating with their partners. But also in your classes, it would be good for you to carve out some time later for them to go back and think about what actually happened and what meaning, what significance of those activities can I as a student derive from what we did earlier in the course. Okay, so I'm going to go through 3 models very quickly. We won't take time to unpack them thoroughly. And you will see that they all have some features in common. But Bowd is a very easy way to start thinking about this. What Bowd is talking about is more ties into this reflection on action part. This ability for students to be able to go back later and to develop meaning from what they've done. And in English, it's given a very catchy phrase of what, so what, now what, which I've sort of translated into Spanish as que, por qué, and ahora qué. And at least this time I spelled it right with only 1 R and not 2 R's. Okay. So what happened? For students to be able to reflect on their experiences, they have to have the ability to go back and actually just describe what happened in the activity. What was that activity? What were the components of that activity that we had to do as part of our Coil interaction? The reflection begins with the so what part. And we'll unpack this in a couple of different models that will give us some more ways of thinking about this. This is the point where the students have the ability to sit back, bring themselves out of the interaction and look on it as kind of as an outsider to think about, well, what was actually the meaning of what happened in that interaction? And then the now what is all of these models of reflective action really are geared toward having the experience create some kind of change on the part of the students so that they approach similar or related activities differently in the future. They have been changed by the experience, they understand why they have been changed by the experience, and they bring a new set of background and skills and so forth to the next kinds of experiences that come up. Okay. So, I mean, if nothing else, what, so what, now what? ¿Qué, por qué, y ahora qué? Preguntas? No. Okay. So, Kolb is another name that is oftentimes thought of in terms of reflective learning. And his model of reflective learning elaborates on this a little bit. He's talking about two different continua. So as we experience and process experiences, we can have our concrete experience, what we're feeling while we're having that experience. So we can approach these experiences from an emotional level or from an analytical level. So feeling or sentir, the emotional component of these experiences, versus thinking and pensar for the analytical component of the experiences. At the same time, we have a continuum between reflection on the experience and actually being involved in the experience. So, watching or mirar, where you can step out of the experience and reflect, look at it from the outside, versus hacer or doing when we are actually in the activity itself. And so the way Kolb puts this together for reflective learning is, what happened? This is very similar to the what or the K in Baude's model. But what was my experience of what happened? And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about learning outcomes and how we can map this onto here. But, this, what was my experience of it, allows the student to relate that experience to them personally, as opposed to, why did it happen, would be more of an analytical treatment. So this is, personal experience. This is trying to understand these experiences in the basis of what frameworks I have, maybe how can I apply course concepts, material that we are talking about in the course, to understanding what happened. And then again, what will I do when and if it happens again? All of these are very forward-looking models and very cyclical models. And hopefully you're beginning to see some commonalities here. So Gibbs also has worked through this material of how to promote reflection on the part of our students. So, ¿qué pasó? What happened? What did I feel about it? Okay, this is again that looking at that emotional component. What Gibbs puts in here is a step of evaluating those experiences. What about the experience was good? What about the experience was not so good? How does my evaluation of the experience reflect back on what I was feeling when the experience was happening? But for it to be reflective learning, we need to bring in that analytical component, to making sense of those experiences based on the frameworks from our classes and on other materials that we're bringing in. So how can I analyze what happened? How can I give meaning to it? What frameworks can I apply? What else could I have done in that experience? And what might I do the next time around? Okay. So what do you see as, this is not a rhetorical question, what do you see as the important components for all of these models of reflective learning?
Can you repeat the question?
Looking at these models, what do you think are the important pieces that make up a reflective learning kind of situation? Because we're going to want to relate that to your Coil experiences. So what is important for reflective learning?
To understand what happened and be able to go back and think about it and improve for the future.
Okay. Same thing? Okay.
And also to involve feelings and mind.
Okay.
Feelings and thoughts.
So, I'm a science person. I teach science and technology kinds of courses. The squishy, touchy-feely aspects of learning are not always comfortable for me, right? Okay. But especially, I think, for Coil collaborations. If you look around at the learning outcomes that are pasted up on the wall there, many of them are touchy-feely, and I'll have a better framework for talking about that in a minute. But we have to, if we are going to guide our students to really get the most out of these intercultural experiences, we cannot ignore that touchy-feely part of it. See.
I'm going to interrupt everything because I have a question about the slide before, but
That's okay. I can remember.
It's because I was on my reflective thing.
Okay.
In the slide before, you presented this kind of
the
circle.
Yeah.
And 2 arrows in a cross.
Right.
And what we have to do is put like a point in balance or.
Well, the reason. Yeah. So the question is how to relate those continua.
Okay.
And the cycle of learning that Coil was talking about to our courses. I presented the model of the 2 continua just to reinforce the point that as you are thinking about your Coil collaborations, think about not only the feeling versus analytical as we talked about, but also think about the times when the students are going to be doing things in the moment versus giving them time to step back and reflect on them from the outside. So, translating those axes that Kolb talks about into that circle of what happened, how do I feel about it, what do I understand about it, what will I do next? It's not. It doesn't necessarily come directly out of it, but the idea is if you are thinking about the emotional and analytical component and the active experience versus the time to be able to step back and think about it, those feed into that cycle of, well, let me just be able to make sure I can describe what happened. And then how did that make me feel? And then what sense do I make of it? And then that's got to lead back into how will that change my actions in the future? Thinking about that reflection versus action continuum. You may have heard the saying that all reflection without any action is kind of impotent. You know, I might spend my whole life on the mountaintop as a hermit reflecting on life, but if I don't ever do anything, then what does it matter? On the other hand, if I am always just doing things without thinking about them, then we have our new president-elect, you know?
I don't know if I understand something, but in my experience, in most of the case, feelings come first than understand what happened. In the same moment, I feel it's good, it's bad, and then sometimes I struggle to know what happened. So why this is the first to understand what happened and then to say, I feel that, because feeling appears at the moment. So
Yes.
and the same moment, sometimes I suddenly say, this is bad. Maybe sometimes you think, well, maybe it can be good, but I feel horrible, or I feel really happy, or I feel at that moment, and then I try to understand what happened.
Yeah, those comments. I agree. These models are more for us thinking about the process, and they may be cleaner than the actual reflective learning, which can be messy. But I think the reason for separating the feelings from the evaluation, yes, we all have emotional experiences immediately as we're having the experience. The evaluation, and I might think, oh, this is horrible what's happening now. I might think, oh, this is horrible what's happening now. But the evaluation is a little bit divorced from that, and if you have a little bit of time to reflect, you can say, yeah, yesterday was pretty bad, and it's probably going to be pretty bad going forward, but maybe if I think about it more, I can find, well, what might have been some of the good things that happened, and how can I understand better the bad things that happened. So we all have immediate emotional experiences, even us science geeky guys who don't like the touchy-feely part. But you shouldn't just stop there. You should be able to then go on and evaluate, well, is what I experienced as bad? Was it really as bad as I experienced it? Were there good pieces? Were there bad pieces? Or what I experienced is great. Well, maybe if I think about it, there were some things that maybe were not so good. So that's, I think, the difference between the direct emotional feeling versus the later trying to unpack those and evaluate a bit. Crystal? Or?
I could also see this model, or even the previous model, as additive, right? So in the evaluation square, it's not that feelings don't go away and
Right.
experience doesn't go away, or the analysis square that you still don't have the experience, feelings, evaluation, and analysis. So I see it
Right.
as additive.
I mean, the analysis might give you the framework from the course concepts or whatever that allow you to make sense of those emotional components.
Right.
And one more thing, I think that if you evaluate, well, you say the feelings are at the moment, but if you take this time to reflect and evaluate, then you can educate your feelings, or you can educate your feelings or your attitude, and then transfer it to a similar situation, but with a better way of reacting, or with a different emotional intelligence, or a modification in your attitude.
You can have a more informed perspective on your feelings.
Well, this is a subject that fascinates me.
Yeah, me too.
And for me, the important part is the attention. How can you retain the attention of somebody, or how can you train somebody to pay attention to both their feelings, their thoughts, and then to have no judgment about it.
Right.
Because judgment, like the judgment that we ourselves kind of like carry and then we put on others is what stops the learning. And then when you learn that any kind of feeling, any kind of action, any kind of thought is just a thought, just a feeling. And then there's the process underneath that needs to keep going, but we usually stop. And because you have a memory of past failure, or you have a pain in your body that is stopping you from doing something, or you, the person that you're interacting with reminds you of somebody that you had some problem with. So that's when everybody puts a block. And the interesting part for me, is to how can I remove that block?
Yeah.
Or how can I help somebody to remove their own block?
Yeah. So I don't think I have a universal answer. As you all develop your collaborations, you'll have to think about, and this, what you just talked about goes back to that reflection in action. How can you configure your learning activities so that your learning activities are more than just a series of checkboxes? And how can you even, what can you do even at the level of writing out the assignment to get the students to be mindful about what they're doing while they're doing it? There are also tools like various kinds of approaches to journaling that we will mention depending on how long we go, that can help students to capture experiences as they're going on that they can then bring back together to reflect.
Let me just make one comment actually about this topic. Since we're all working on an international, intercultural project, although many of our classes are very subject matter based, when people study whether or not students learn intercultural values or intercultural global awareness like ideas through international education programs like Study Abroad, other things we do in the Coil world. What they do is they look at the reflection. They look at evidence from reflection. And a lot of times that's journaling in different forms. But this is essentially what folks that study this topic want to see in order to determine what students learn about the other, about living and being from a different place. So it's a very pertinent topic. If you look at all these learning objectives about intercultural ideas, global awareness, intercultural communication, this essentially is what you have to consider if you want to actually find out if your students achieve those goals.
Okay. So I want to take a little time to map what we've just been talking about onto what I see are some issues about developing these learning outcomes that we've been talking about. First, I want to talk about over here. Many of the goals that are the outcomes that have been put up on the board earlier this morning have really been focused on these intercultural outcomes, which is great. I mean, that is what COIL is all about. But we are also all faculty coming from disciplines. And so as you think about outcomes for your course, and as your partner thinks about outcomes for her or his course, there are going to be things that you want to get out of your course that might apply to enriching the experience of your students with the discipline that you're looking at. So, Crystal is doing psychology, Louise is doing economics, And ideally, from the interaction, there will be two kinds of outcomes that come out of that. We've been perhaps more focused on the ability of, we want our students to come out with the ability to work interculturally as effective global citizens. But at the same time, on working on their projects, Crystal's students in psychology will have their understanding of psychology and cultural psychology enriched by the economic perspective that Louisa's students will be bringing. And the same thing the other way. Louisa's students, he wants them to be good intercultural global citizens, but also to have the interaction with Crystal's students, have them acquire a different appreciation and understanding of economics. So as you are thinking about your learning outcomes for your course, clearly we want to encourage this, but don't forget this. Okay? Ideally in these collaborations, it is a win-win situation. Your students are benefiting from the perspectives, both disciplinary and cultural, that your partner students provide, and your partner students benefit from the disciplinary and cultural perspectives that your students provide. At the same time, we can think about different kinds of outcomes, which when I'm working with faculty, I abbreviate here as this ASK. So many of us in our courses, we have this content that we feel like we need to teach. We've got to cover these topics, otherwise we're not succeeding as instructors. And that's all about the knowledge or cognitive domain primarily. And are my students learning principles of geology in the course? Are they, learning the rock cycle and this and that? But we can also talk about, are they developing different kinds of skills in terms of communication and analytical skills and the ability to, process numbers if that's appropriate. The touchy-feely part that I'm not so comfortable with is in this affective domain. How are the experiences in the course affecting the way the students perceive themselves and the world, their openness to others, whether it's other cultures or other disciplines or whatever other. And so all of these are fodder, are opportunities for you to think about the kinds of outcomes that you will want to have for your collaboration. You might think that, this touchy-feely affective stuff perhaps maps onto the intercultural, and the cognitive domain maps onto the disciplinary, but it's much more complicated than that. Because to be effective with these intercultural outcomes, the students not only have to be open, but they have to understand, some of the aspects of the other culture. So there's a cognitive ability and a skills. They have to be able to communicate. So all of these feed in here, and the same thing for the disciplinary. Perhaps the experiences that your students, perhaps the experiences of the students I have in my geology class will give them a different appreciation for geology, right? And so we've got the ability here. And I want my students, even as budding geologists, to develop various kinds of skills for communicating and analyzing materials. So you take all of that, and then, how can I have students be reflective about that? Right? How can I have them be mindful while they are experiencing these things? And how can I provide them an opportunity later to reflect on this? Muy complicado. Please keep this framework in mind. I think it may help you think about a wider variety of outcomes, but at the end of the day, you need to figure out, ideally you will want to figure out how can these outcomes lead to meaning, lead to the creation of meaning on the part of our students. And for that to happen, we really need to make space for the reflective learning component. Questions? So, I think I have talked enough for a bit. What I want you all to do, let me talk for a little bit more. See.
I'm a very slow processor. Do you have any research? Oh. Do you have any research on speed of processing? Personally, I'm very slow to process. It could take me years to process.
Right. Yeah, I mean that brings up a question that goes beyond just reflective learning. That brings up a question that will go to the heart of your Coil collaboration and to the issues of assessment that we talked about earlier. After your Coil collaboration, your students may feel less confident interculturally than before because they now realize how naive they were before. Okay? So initially, you might find it looks like the students are worse than before. Okay? But I mean, don't be too disappointed or too disheartened. But the speed of processing is an important question. Like if you are spending 5 weeks in the middle of the semester to do a collaboration, is it enough time by the end of the semester for them to really have understood the significance of that? And I think the same is true in study abroad. Oftentimes, it's only years later that students thinking back about their study abroad experience realize how transformative it was.
Yeah, it's really a good point. Typically, I mean, there's different ways to measure this. I mean, and frankly, the measurements themselves there's question marks there as well. But if you spend 3 months in a study abroad program where you're taking a full load of classes, 4 classes, maybe more, and living in the culture, and varying degrees of support. I mean, you may have no same culture people with you. You may have many same culture people with you. The actual change in someone's score on these measurements of intercultural awareness, intercultural knowledge, intercultural skills is very small. Okay, I mean, maybe a person makes a one-step change over 3 months from a stage called minimalization or defense to minimalization. There's 7 stages in total, going from no to adapt to full adaptation. So it is a long-term question that a process that is going. This is only one small part of changing anything really.
Within the context of our courses, though, we can only do what we can do. And so you want to develop a collaborative exercise on the part of your students that opens them up to these experiences, and you want to set up your course in such a way that they have opportunities to think about what it all means, but you're not going to necessarily capture all of the impact that the collaboration had on the students, because you can't, as a faculty member teaching them during one semester, you can't follow them 2, 3, 5 years down the road. Well, the last thing I want to say before opening it up into a workshopping kind of activity is, I don't know if it's just because I'm an old geezer, but I find that my students do not know very well how to be reflective. I think they're growing up in a media environment where they're never tasked to be reflective. Many of them are never alone with their thoughts because there's always a screen in front of them or something going in their ear. And so part of the challenge to get the students to be reflective about their learning will be to get them to be reflective, period. And one way to promote that, I think, is by providing them very clear prompts that will guide their reflection. I have handed out a couple of sheets of, I also have them sort of here in the session materials. So if you go back, for example, to that simple Bode's triangle, what, so what, now what, you can think about, well, what are the questions, what are the reflection prompts that I can provide my students that will get them to think about each of those pieces. So you might even have to give them questions that will help them to be able to just describe what the interaction was. If you're having your students collaborate with their partners from another culture, are they going to be capturing what is actually going on in that description and in that interaction? And then the so what, both the emotional and the analytical component, and then the now what, how will I, where do I go from here? This is the front side of the sheet I gave you, these reflection prompts from this Edutopia resource. Structures those a little bit differently. Backward looking is kind of like what happened, but the inward looking is, how did this impact me? The outward looking, how was I in relationship to others involved? And the forward looking is more the now what kind of framework. Same thing here. I mean, these are specifically targeted at e-portfolio reflections. So again, you can look through some of these. What I'd like to do, so that I can stop talking, is to have you do a little bit of workshopping. So I've got on the left side here what I want you to do. So first, working individually. How many of you regularly incorporate reflection into the activities other than Josie? I know Josie does, okay? So many of you already do. But I want you all to think about activities that you have already existing in your courses. So not necessarily about your collaboration, but maybe even take a course where you have not, an activity where you have not specifically included reflection before. Look through the reflection prompts examples and think about how you might take that existing activity that maybe has some level of reflection already, or an activity that you don't focus on reflection, and how might you change that activity to make it a more reflective activity. So how would you modify it? Which of these reflection prompts, or how would you take some of these reflection prompts and customize them for your activity? Think again about how you might change your activity to make sure that students are more reflective in the process. But also, in that course where you have this activity, how would you follow up that activity later with additional questions for the students to think about to give them the ability to reflect back on their action? And how would you then provide feedback? So I want each of you to do that individually for a little bit, and then share your examples with your partners, because I think that will be a good basis for then thinking about, as you are thinking about learning activities tomorrow, the task list that we've talked about, how you can think about incorporating reflection. So describe your original activity to your partner, discuss how you think you might increase the reflective component of it, provide these examples, and then you can have a conversation about how that might apply to your coil.
It's something that we already do.
See, yeah. So in order to model this, I want you to be mindful about this as you're doing it. So I've given you a checklist on the left side, but I don't want you to just go through a checklist. This is essentially a modification of a very common approach, think, pair, share, that you might use yourself in class, where you throw out a topic, you have your students think about it individually, then turn to a partner and share, and then report out to the whole class. So, as you are thinking about your assignment, think about, well, in about 5 minutes I'm going to be talking with my partner, and I want to be mindful about how I'm thinking about my assignment here. So we'll do this for as long as we need to do it. And, again, work individually, then discuss with your partner, and then we'll try to see if there are some common features that came out of your discussions. Okay, so I forgot to hit record after we came back to resume our discussion after the workshopping activity, so I didn't capture much of our discussion of the observations that came out of the individual and pairs working on workshopping reflection prompts. I just have a few notes that I scribbled down during the 5-10 minute discussion we had. But I'm going to let this play out, and we had a little bit of discussion then about an initial discussion about the use of e-portfolios on the subsequent slides, but again, those weren't recorded, and there were some slides we didn't get to at the end. I'm just going to leave them attached to the end of the presentation, and they should just show up as silent slides showing up at the end of the movie when I export this.